We'll get this straight so that we like it. Hi, welcome to Aspects of Energy. I'm Elaine Brewster and so happy to have you joining us. This is a forum where we learn ways to raise our energy. And you probably already know that pretty much everything in this program relates in some way to the book I wrote about my husband's cancer journey called Scott's Choice. Here's something that I wrote. I woke in the morning of what would be my husband's last day on earth to find him not doing well. I called Sam, who had been working energetically with Scott, to see what I needed to do. To my surprise, he didn't answer with any sort of health regimen. Instead, he said, Scott feels cheated by a young man, about 3.5 years ago. Scott has great bitterness toward him over money. Can you think who hurt him? I knew immediately. And when I told Sam his name, he said, yes, he's the one. You go tell Scott. It won't do any good to keep these feelings toward him. Don't let him ruin your life. Your feelings toward him are only blocking your continued progress. Tell him to give up those feelings toward that man and let them go to the Lord. Today, we're talking about the idea that healing comes through forgiveness, and also the concept that we block our progress by not forgiving. So first of all, I just want to turn it to all of you. Why is it so hard to forgive? And maybe we can, there aren't many of us, so you could probably just speak up, but if you want to use the hand down at the bottom, that would be fine also. Why is it so hard to forgive? What would you say?
One word, Elaine, pride.
Pride, there you go. And that's a good word too, Linda. What else are you thinking? You know,
I don't know. I don't know if it's pride, but like when someone has wronged you, at some point, if you hold on to it long enough, it's like you almost want to get back at them. That bubbles up if you don't deal with it. So like, I'm not going to forget this, because not that if I have a chance, I will intentionally hurt them, but this hurts so much that I want to see if maybe there's something that could happen that will hurt you like it hurt me. Just holding on to it. It's not healthy.
Right. But it makes sense to us. Sometimes along that line, it seems like if we forgive someone, we're letting them off easy. You know, it doesn't seem fair to us. I've thought, well, I've got some stories. These are personal stories, and I hope that you'll give me some of your own stories also. I asked my next door neighbor if I could use her gardener, and she said, sure. And she told me how much she paid him so that I could pay him commensurate. And she said, but kind of watch out because he tends to take advantage. And he did. He parked his huge orchard ladder in the back of my yard all winter, which I don't mind. I've got space, but he didn't ask. He just left it there. And that really ticked me off. Every time I look outside, and instead of seeing the beautiful snow, I'm seeing this stupid orchard ladder. So in the spring, I cleverly devised a way that I could get paid for that botheration. So I asked him to do some pruning for me, and he did. And then I said, you've already been paid. You left your ladder here, so that's your rental. And I thought for a few days that I was very clever. But then this is what I noticed. I noticed that instead of waving at him like I'd done before, I was hurrying to make sure that his back was turned before I got in my car. I made sure that when I went out and got my mail, he was never in their yard. And this only took me a few days before I realized I had now changed my life, and I'd changed it for the worse. And so what could I do about that? So I wrote him a check for the pruning and gave him a note and told him, thank you for for his work. And then he always keeps his truck open. And so I just left it on the front seat of his truck. And so there it was. And he was happy to see that. And after he got paid and reimbursed, then all of a sudden life was equal again. And now he can come over and sing his funny little mariachi songs for me and whistle, and I can wave to him and say, hey, how's the day? So I think that's the first thing that we need to do is, recognize that we've done something. Is anyone thinking of their own horrible story? That was a really embarrassing story, people.
No, but it connects. I remember I was a lot younger. I think I was in middle school, and I had a friend. She was a neighbor, and she let me borrow a book. And I love books. I love reading. And I held on to it for too long. I don't know what too long was, but I know I didn't give it back to her when I initially said I would. And then it was months later, then she borrowed a book of mine. She still has that book. I never got it back. I'm like, I want my book back, but I guess she's sort of paying me back because I took my time. But yeah, that was silly.
That makes us feel better to thinking it that way. Forgiveness does all kinds of wonderful things for us. A different Linda Morris this morning just said, forgiveness isn't for them, it releases us. And so here's another story of a neighbor across the street. I had taken her to a meeting with me, and for some reason the meeting just wasn't turning out the way she wanted. And she said, this isn't what I want. And she stormed out. And I didn't really know why she was so upset. And she's a really easygoing person. She's got 10 children. You have to learn to be easygoing.
Yes.
And she wasn't easygoing. She was mad, and I was in tears. It was really awful. And I didn't feel I had caused this, but the next day was Sunday, and we go to the same church. And I thought, I can't go there to church and talk about Christ when we're feeling this way toward each other. So I sat down to write a note, which then I was going to run over to her house. And in the middle of writing the note, the phone rang. Guess who it was? It was her, because she had also felt bad. And so she called to apologize and said, oh, I went way overboard, and I apologize, so we're both apologizing. And I laughed and said, I'm actually in the middle of writing a note to you, and I'm going to bring you the note. So I finished the note after the phone call, and I ran it over to her house, and we got to church, and we were square again. We didn't have to feel like we had to avoid each other. And I think for me, that was one of the fastest times that I've ever, done that forgiving and made it square with someone else. And that was just a lot better than having it go on for weeks and months.
Yes.
I think we've all heard stories or know of family members who had some problem with a business or something like that. And you got this when mom died, and I wanted this. And now they don't talk to each other anymore. And that goes on for years and years. And so even though I didn't feel like I started it, I finished it. That was a really lovely thing to do. Here's another really interesting aspect, is that sometimes we hold on to grudges in loyalty of another person. We feel like we are giving solidarity to a friend or a loved one if we hold on to their grudge. So I have a true story for you. So I knew, I'm going to pull this back to me so I can see if I can see these. All right, here's lady one and lady two. Whoops, there we go. And I knew both of them, but she was more of an acquaintance and she was a friend. Okay, both of these had children that were in the high school orchestra. And our high school orchestra was as good as a community orchestra, partly because their violin playing children played so well. They'd taken lessons since they were 4. So, by the time they're 16, 17, they're really good. And it made the sound of the whole orchestra better. Well, her two children were supposed to get the number 1 and number 2 slots in the orchestra. She came to the orchestra teacher and said, I want my children to have the number 1 and number 2 slots. And if you don't, I will pull them from the program because they don't need it. And so guess what the orchestra director did? He chose her children. Somehow she found out about it. And so she was mad at lady number 2. Well, she was my friend. And so now I am in solidarity with her. And I'm really ticked at this lady. Well, guess what happened? These 2 ladies ended up, their families were all performing families. I think she had seven children. I think she had 5. They ended up with their families both having theaters and performing in Branson. They're walking along this streets of this really fairly small city, but most of that, I mean, more than that, they attended the same church. And so they were probably having to, it's a lay church where it's the members of the church who kind of do the work and the lessons. So they have to support one another in listening and giving lessons. They maybe had to be on the Easter dinner committee and both helped to put on the decor on the tables for the Easter dinner. Maybe they even had to work on some music together. They worked it out. And so they were fine. But then meanwhile, here was me over here, still raging and still mad, never even realizing that they had gotten over it. Does that ring a bell for anybody? I'm probably not the only one on that. In terms of recognizing, and this I'm not going to let it, but this could take us into another direction. As we said earlier, we need to recognize that something needs to be done. And as one man mentioned this morning, Gary Akabenko, we need to forgive ourselves. And that's often harder to do than anyone else in our life. But the first thing we need to do is to recognize that something needs to be done. Sometimes we ignore those things, or they don't really come up in our brain and our psyche until maybe the year before we die, if we're sick, or soon before we die. There's a lot of really good processing that goes on when people are getting to that point. And this is what happened with my mother. She would tell this story often in the year before she died. But it wasn't until that year before she died I even knew about it. It turns out to have been a major story in her psyche. She was 9 years old, and her little 7-year-old brother had just drowned. He was the youngest in the family, golden curled. He was the darling child of the family, and he was gone. So my little 9-year-old mother climbs up on her mother's lap to comfort her mother, and her mother, in her grief, pushed that little 9-year-old off her lap. Well, what that set in my mom now for the next 65 years of her life was that she wasn't loved, she wasn't good enough, maybe even feelings of abandonment. And somehow through all those feelings, she managed to be a wonderful mother, but she had these deep, deep feelings that then were causing her to act and react in certain ways. And so that was really good for her to think through that. And interestingly enough, my mom and dad lived in Salt Lake City, but they were buried in a cemetery about 20 miles north of Salt Lake. And so we were up there in a little town called Centerville, and we were having this lovely little box lunch for the whole family to meet together at one house. And my aunt lived in the next door house, and she was sick. So I decided I better go see my aunt while I was there. And she had some strange condition where once she started an action, until her husband stopped her, she continued the action. So in this case, she was brushing her teeth. She was brushing her teeth. She was in front of the mirror in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, and she was not stopping. And I went out and I asked my uncle, and he said, oh, she won't stop until I put my hand on her arm. And it was just such strange behavior. I came out to the car and we drove back home, and I told my husband, and he said, I would have thought your aunt would have died before your mother. And all of a sudden, with absolute clarity, I said, no, my mother needed to be first. She needed, out of the 4 sisters, she needed to be the one who died first. And I said, I don't think that aunt will be able to die until my mom has rectified everything with her parents. And a few months later, that aunt died. And when she did, I knew that my mom was okay. So sometimes there are things in us that even come through DNA. And it makes us act the way we do. And maybe it's not the way we want to act. And so thinking about that and finding out what those things are. Unfortunately, if you're like me, usually you find out by offending someone about, not someone, 3 someones. You know, when you find the same response to you about 3 times in a row, you go, oh, okay, I am acting a certain way. So people are reacting. I need to change this. And it gives us a chance to change. What are your thoughts?
Well, when you were sharing your story, thank you for doing that. I was thinking of my mother, who's in her 60s, and then her mother, who's now deceased. And I already see that there are some issues that my mother may have with holding unforgiveness for her mom based on a conversation. And my mother isn't very open to having dialogue with me about uncomfortable topics. So I'm trying to work through my situation so that I don't have any unforgiveness towards her. And I want to be able at some point to maybe help direct her in a way so that she can start unloading those things she's carrying, because she spends a lot of time thinking on those unfortunate memories. And I just know that forgiveness, if it were easy, okay, I think because it's difficult, your peace once you conquer it is even greater. Because I can forgive certain things, but there's a few things I'm like, oh, I need to wait on that.
Right.
It's too hard, too tough.
Right. And I think that kind of honesty is okay. I went to a processing session once, and her way of doing things was as you would talk about things, uncomfortable things came up, and she allowed you to give each one a color and to give each one a shape. And then after you'd done that, she would let you put them in this mental basket. So here's this basket full of all these weird colored, weird shapes. And then she said, now somebody comes in the room who is the greatest somebody that you can think of. For some people, it might be their grandpa. For some people, it might be Buddha, Muhammad. For me, it was Christ. And she said, will you give him your basket? And I have this written in my book. And I thought, no, I don't want to give that to him. That's all the crud. I want to give him the beautiful times. I want to give him the singing. I want to give him the music lessons of my kids. I want to give him the times that I sat down and read books with him. I want to. And then I thought, but that's why he came. He came to take rid of all of that stupid stuff. And so I said, yes, I'll give him my basket. And as soon as I consciously made that choice, it was gone. It was completely gone. All of those dumb shapes and colors, and it was gone. But on the second time, I went for this processing session, and now we're talking about some different things. I had some things in my basket, and I wasn't ready. I knew it was stupid because they were bad, but I honestly wasn't ready to give them all up. And so she said, "Can he take your basket?" And I says, "Well, he can have this and this and this, but I'm keeping this for right now." So there is an honesty, I don't know, honesty/stupidity issue. But I know that we want to live our lives honestly. Speaking of honestly, I could not help but think of this one story, and I know that you've heard it, from Corrie Ten Boom, who wrote The Hiding Place. And she was talking about honesty, and her honesty finally extended to where she found she couldn't forgive by herself. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. Suddenly it was all there, the room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, my sister's pain-blanched face, and you remember her sister died there. He came up to me in church as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask more? "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me and help me to forgive him." I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed a silent prayer. "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart spread a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. What are your thoughts? Hattie Jane, I know you're thinking over there.
Well, that one kind of blew me away. Really, that is something. We talked earlier today, talked about when I knew that my life pathway was going to be definitely changed by moving to my mother's home and shepherding her in her years with Alzheimer's, and my choice to be positive about it. But another thing came up about forgiveness, and I had an experience in which it was having great physical discomfort and things, but getting things done. And I was due to fly home. So anxious I was to be flying home, I screwed up and wound up at the airport a day earlier. And they looked at me and said, "You're not due here." And they said, "Go over there." And I went over to the council, and they said, "Well, no, you're not due here until tomorrow. You can't come in. Come back tomorrow." Well, I had signed out of the hotel. I had everything packed with me. I was on my last 2 cents, literally. All cards and everything. So I had so they wouldn't let me stay at the airport, where at least I could have slept on a chair. So, well, I trooped back through the free territory and walked across the things and got back to the hotel, which I knew, expecting somebody, I would know somebody there, had no idea what to do about it, but it was the place I knew. It was a strange city. And fortunately, a guardian angel heard my story and said, "Come stay here," and we're staying over. And it turned into be a little bit difficult because the person who had signed for the room, was paying for the room, hadn't planned on having company. She was upset. Well, the next day after I got home, made it home, fortunately, so called her to apologize again, and she said, "Well, how did that happen?" I said, "Well, I just screwed it up." She said, "I don't believe you. I think you did it deliberately to get out paying another day."
Oh,
And that was such a shock to me. Such
wow.
a shock. So I knew I didn't want to respond like I felt, which was offended, upset, angry, betrayed. And I tried to make sure that my voice didn't dearly apologize and asked her to pay for it, and hung up. Uh, and thought about it all night, still staying upset. But the beauty of it was the next day I had a uh, monthly conference with my financial assistant who helps me make sure I pay my bills. Not that they give me money, but I use my money to pay bills, not to go buy something. My lifetime reality. But I was able to acknowledge that, of course, she saw it like that because she could not perceive of someone just totally screwing up when they were supposed to go someplace.
Because she never would.
And much less without having any money. I mean, it just was not in her conception. And I realized it also was not in my conception to recognize how my ADD, which wasn't diagnosed until I was after 50, how those patterns had allowed me to create a situation which really someone couldn't understand.
Yes.
So I would not be angry at her. I'm hurt at her, but I'm not angry at her because it was such a gift.
Mm.
Because when you grow up, whatever your problems you're having, whatever mistakes you've been making, because that's the way you're thinking or that's the way you're educated, and it's causing you problems as you go along, it's real hard to change that. It's hard to recognize it. Even though you study about it, it's hard to recognize it. But that was a very strong recognition, and that has really helped me these years to continue forth, to continue accepting myself and forgiving those I need to and being forgiven. So that kind of where I was at.
That's fabulous, Hattie Jane. Thank you for that. Here are some quotes. Not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. That's by Anne Lamott. Greg Bell, who is president and CEO of the Utah Hospital Association, said, "Forgiving or letting go of grudges is not for sissies. It's among the hardest things we can do." And Gandhi said it this way, "The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong." So I guess that idea that Linda said about pride, you know, to give up pride in order to have the bigger picture, like you did, to see a bigger picture of perspective, like Hattie Jane said, or to not take offense at all. That's humility. That is letting go of pride. This is paraphrased, but Mother Teresa said something like, "We talk of taking offense. We can't take it unless we pick it up. I simply refuse to pick it up." And then this morning, well, you remember the lady that had a frozen turkey thrown at her on the highway in New York, and it completely crushed her face, and she had to go through numerous surgeries. She was in a coma for weeks, and then she went to the hearing of the young man and his friends who had done it, and they had stolen a credit card, and they'd gone on a shopping spree. So they were teenagers. They were just being stupid and laughing too hard and everything. And so they'd taken this turkey, never thinking, and had thrown it, and it had come in her windshield. And so here's this lady whose life has been altered greatly, but she went to his hearing, and she investigated about him first, found out that he was 17 years old, and he was maybe up for 25 years in prison. And she didn't want to do that. So in front of the whole court, she went up and hugged him and forgave him. And you can look up the turkey lady and forgiveness, and you'll see the story. Her name was Ruvolo. And so for her, forgiveness was definitely not a weakness or a capitulation, but it was empowerment. And I have it written somewhere on her tombstone, or in her epitaph. It says to forgive. And so she became really, really known for that. There's one more story I wanted to share with you. This is a story of, can you see that? I'm not looking at me right now. Put it down lower. Okay, lower. There we go. Chris Williams. Chris was, well, I'll just say it in his words. This is about his wife, Michelle. Michelle and I both saw a pair of headlights appear at the top of a hill in front of us, moving at an unbelievably high speed and already crossing the median. It was on a direct collision course with our car. I attempted to swerve out of the way, but to no avail. The vehicle T-boned our car with the sickening, dense, crushing thud of metal on metal, a quick, catastrophic, singular sound of devastation. Then it was quiet. There was no sound from anyone in the car. I could see Michelle motionless. At that instant, I knew that she and our unborn baby were gone. I looked in the back seat, and I could tell that I think it was 11-year-old Ben and 9-year-old Anna were also gone. What I was witnessing was unreal. I couldn't take it anymore. From deep inside my body came a sound of excruciating anguish and pain, of body and spirit being crushed. It was more profound than just feeling helpless or powerless or feeling physical pain. I saw the car that had just hit us resting upside down on its roof. Suddenly, an immense peace and silence filled the inside of the vehicle, my soul, and my thoughts. I heard a voice in my mind that was not my own. It was straightforward and filled with power, and the voice said, "Let it go." I immediately felt an enabling power beyond my own, healing and enlarging my crushed soul. I knew exactly what I had to do. This was not my burden to carry. I was commanded in no uncertain terms not to try to pick it up. I knew who should carry that burden. He who had already endured the soul-crushing press of the pains of all men, including this burden. As I lay on the hospital gurney, I learned it was a 17-year-old boy who had been drinking. I could feel the love the Savior had for that teenage boy. All I felt in that moment was that the Savior had succored me, anxious to heal and bind up rather than have this crash tear up our families and the community. What others said the most to me was, if you can forgive someone for doing that to your family, certainly I can forgive. Chris Williams. I probably could have had him on this call today, but I wanted to have your input and not just hear from him. Well, he also said, we are loved by the pure love of Jesus Christ, and he wants us to fulfill our potential. In the case of my husband, he did let go of that grudge toward that fellow, as well as everything negative in his body. The Reiki master, who was there at his dying, kept saying, come on, Scott, give it up. You don't need this. And finally, she pronounced, there's nothing negative in your body. You can come back and live a wonderful life because now you know how to. Or you can go on and stand before Heavenly Father and be able to say, I'm clean, I'm ready. What do you want me to do? And that's what he chose to do. The fact that he could and would change his life in 4 months' time was nothing short of a miracle. So I hope this week that we can forgive ourselves or someone else and just give it to the Lord so that we can be more peaceful and happy in our families and communities. And maybe, like Mother Teresa, just not pick it up. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, beautiful week. I love you all. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.